What if the most terrifying woman in history did not rise through violence, but through something far more unsettling? The ability to enter a person's mind so quietly they never noticed the moment they lost control. And what if the darkness that shaped her began long before the world even knew her name? These questions matter because every survival instinct you trust could be the very thing someone like her uses against you. Before she became a legend whispered by terrified advisors and broken rulers, she started as a quiet observer in a world ruled by brutality. While others learned to fight with weapons, she mastered something infinitely sharper. She watched how people flinched when threatened, how they softened when comforted, how they revealed their fears without realizing they had spoken. She learned that humans broadcast their weaknesses long before they speak them. And she listened. Always listened. Her childhood was not defined by innocence but by exposure to power games. Adults thought she was too young to understand. She saw how authority bends under guilt, how ambition corrodes loyalty, how affection becomes a leash when held by the right hands. The palace where she grew up was not a home, it was a living laboratory of manipulation, and she studied it with a precision that would one day terrify entire empires. Nothing in her world was stable, so she learned to create stability by controlling the emotions of others. The first signs of her psychological dominance appeared early. She could calm a furious general with a single sentence or ignite suspicion between allies with an innocent question. She realized quickly that truth and lies do not matter nearly as much as timing. A whisper delivered at the perfect moment was more powerful than any decree. She did not just understand human nature, she weaponized it, and people underestimated her, which only strengthened her. They dismissed her charm as innocence, her intelligence as curiosity, her emotional insight as intuition. They never realized she was cataloging every reaction, storing every weakness, building a mental map of those around her. She was not born dangerous. She became dangerous because everyone assumed she couldn't be. As her influence grew, a pattern emerged. She never attacked directly. She let people destroy themselves while believing every step was their idea. She nudged their fears, magnified their doubts, and positioned herself as the only person who truly understood them. Victims called it guidance. Historians now call it psychological warfare. And if you've ever wondered how manipulation becomes a form of power, this is where the pattern begins. You ever felt like someone could see through you more clearly than you could see yourself? Or sensed that a person's kindness had an edge you couldn't explain? These early moments in her life show how subtle manipulation becomes terrifying when wrapped in empathy. If this glimpse into her origins already unsettles you, share your thoughts in the comments, because understanding these patterns is the only way to recognize them in your own life. And if this opening is giving you that feeling of something deeper unfolding, leave a like and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Because the next steps in her evolution are far darker than anything you've seen so far, and everything we uncover from here connects directly to these early shadows. She discovered early that every person carried a hidden fracture, a point where their confidence thinned and their emotions became unstable, and she learned to press exactly where it hurt without ever appearing responsible. What made her approach so unsettling was not the cruelty itself, but the precision behind it, because she understood vulnerability not as a flaw, but as an entrance. Whenever she stepped into a room, she could sense who feared abandonment, who craved recognition, who lived drowning in unspoken guilt. These emotional signatures became her maps, guiding her toward quiet domination long before anyone realized they were being studied. Her manipulation did not begin with grand schemes, but with subtle emotional cues that reshaped perception. She would mirror a person's tone until they felt understood, then slowly shift the rhythm of conversation to align with her motives. If someone sought approval, she offered validation that felt rare and addictive. If someone feared conflict, she wrapped her suggestions in gentle reassurance that masked her underlying push for control. Over time, her presence became a comforting trap, one that made people reveal secrets they never meant to share, believing she was the only one who truly listened. But listening was her deadliest weapon. She understood that people exposed themselves not through confession, but through patterns, micro-expressions, hesitations, the momentary tremor in the voice when a forbidden topic surfaces. She collected these, fragments like a strategist preparing for battle, each detail a future lever she could pull to steer their decisions. The brilliance of her method was how natural it felt to those under her influence, as though they were arriving at choices organically when, in truth, she had been sculpting their emotional landscape long before the decision appeared. Once she knew someone's deepest insecurity, she did not strike immediately. She planted doubt slowly, like a seed growing in darkness. A small comment delivered casually, a carefully timed silence, a suggestion masked as concern. These gestures accumulated until her targets began to question their own thoughts, rearranging their identity around the version of reality she created for them. And because she never raised her voice or demanded obedience, her control appeared to them as internal clarity rather than external pressure. The most disturbing part was how she could transform emotional vulnerability into dependence. She offered comfort only after she quietly intensified the very fears she pretended to soothe, creating a cycle in which her approval felt like relief and her absence like collapse. People began seeking her guidance unintentionally, believing she could sense truths they could not articulate. What they never noticed was how their trust became the cage she built around them, a cage that felt like safety because she crafted it from their own emotions. Her power grew because no one perceived her as a threat. Vulnerability felt like connection in her hands, and connection felt like devotion. By the time her influence became visible, the roots of her control were already too deep, woven into the emotional fabric of those who believed they were making their own choices. And this ability to weaponize vulnerability so elegantly was only the beginning, because the tactics she developed next would escalate from emotional manipulation to structured domination, drawing her victims into a psychological labyrinth designed entirely around their weaknesses, a labyrinth from which escape became nearly impossible. By the time she reached the center of her social circles, she had already mastered the art of isolation. But isolation was not mere physical separation. It was a psychological architecture she built around every target. She understood that the human mind craves validation and fear in equal measure, and by controlling both, she could ensure obedience without overt threats. Friends became tools, allies became extensions of her influence, and rivals were subtly reprogrammed to doubt themselves. Every interaction, every word exchanged, was cataloged, measured, and turned into leverage for the future. She created invisible cages using invisible keys, emotional bonds so delicate and precise that her victims would never recognize the pattern until it was too late. Her tactics for mental domination were as intricate as a chess master's strategy, where each pawn represented not just a person but a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. She learned to identify the smallest fractures: discontent at home, envy in the office, fear of inadequacy, and then orchestrated situations that amplified these emotions, all while presenting herself as the only solution. A glance here, a whispered observation there, a subtle rumor planted with impeccable timing. These were her instruments of silent control. People began to adjust their behavior unconsciously, aligning their actions with the invisible currents she had set in motion. By the time anyone realized they were being manipulated, the choices they believed were their own had long been predetermined. Her understanding of human psychology went beyond mere observation. It became predictive. She could anticipate how someone would respond to a specific comment, how their defenses would rise or collapse, and when they would act to preserve what they thought was autonomy. This predictive mastery allowed her to craft situations that made her influence feel natural, inevitable, even desirable. Trust, fear, admiration, and desire all became threads in the tapestry she wove, each reinforcing the other until resistance seemed impossible. The brilliance of her manipulation was in its invisibility. Her targets could feel themselves making decisions freely, even as every path led exactly where she wanted. She also learned the importance of narrative. Every action she took, every interaction, was embedded within a story that justified her behavior and reframed the actions of others. Allies believed they were part of a shared vision. Enemies assumed their failures were their own, and observers often misread her influence as coincidence or charisma. She was a master storyteller of reality itself, editing perceptions in real time, shifting context, creating ambiguity, and always leaving the impression that the choices her victims made were born of their own reasoning. This method not only secured compliance, but also implanted doubt and self-questioning, making her control more resilient than any overt command could achieve. But perhaps her most dangerous skill was patience. She understood that dominance is not achieved in a moment, but over time. She could seed doubt, nurture dependency, and shape behavior across months or years, making her targets complicit in their own subjugation. And by the time the full extent of her control became evident, the emotional and social structures she had manipulated were so tightly intertwined with their identities that rebellion seemed not only impossible, but unimaginable. Her power was invisible because it was woven into the very fabric of perception, trust, and desire, creating a psychological labyrinth where every exit was blocked by the architecture of her own making. She perfected a ritual of manipulation so subtle and methodical that most victims mistook it for a moment of emotional clarity. It always began the same way, with silence. Not the passive, kind, but a sharpened, intentional quiet that drew people toward her, making them feel as though their thoughts were echoing too loudly in their own minds. In that silence, she watched their breathing shift, their eyes flicker, their posture falter. She knew that the human mind reveals more truth when it scrambles to fill a void, and she let that void stretch just long enough for insecurities to surface unaided. Once discomfort began to grow, she moved to the second phase, mirroring emotion. She reflected back the exact sentiment her target needed to see, transforming herself into the perfect confidant. To someone who felt misunderstood, she appeared empathetic. To someone who craved validation, she became admiring. To someone suffocated by fear, she embodied calm certainty. This emotional mimicry softened defenses without a single word, making the victim feel seen in a way that felt intimate and disarming. And that was her trap. She constructed a connection that felt genuine while remaining entirely calculated. The third phase was destabilization. She introduced a carefully chosen observation, never aggressive, never direct, designed to provoke doubt. A gentle question about loyalty, a subtle suggestion that someone was being deceptive, or a quiet remark that hinted at hidden dangers. These comments were crafted like surgical incisions, small but deep, creating tiny ruptures in the victim's sense of security. And because the doubt seemed to arise internally, they never realized she was the one guiding the emotional shift. Insecurity grew like a shadow, stretching slowly across their perception until they no longer trusted their own instincts. Once uncertainty took root, she shifted into the fourth phase, offering clarity. She framed herself as the stable foundation in the chaos she had engineered. Her advice felt like truth, her guidance like rescue. Victims clung to her words without noticing how their emotional dependence had already formed. The instinct to seek balance drove them to her, again and again, until her presence became synonymous with relief. By the time they recognized the pattern, if they ever did, their autonomy had already eroded. She had infiltrated their emotions so effectively that separating their voice from hers felt like tearing away part of their identity. The final phase was reinforcement. She repeated this cycle in subtle variations, adjusting it to each person's psychological profile. Over time, this ritual became a loop that tightened around the victim's mind. They felt gratitude toward her for moments she orchestrated, guilt for doubts she planted, and loyalty to the very person dismantling their independence. And because she never demanded obedience outright, they mistook manipulation for mutual trust. Her power endured not because she controlled actions, but because she shaped perceptions. That was the brilliance of her ritual. Once internalized, it continued operating even when she was nowhere near. If any part of this ritual made you reflect on someone you once trusted too easily, or reminded you of a moment where your instincts felt quieter than they should have, share your thoughts in the comments so we can explore how these psychological patterns take root in real life and how easily any of us might step into a trap we never saw being built around us. Her rise into the political sphere was not the result of formal authority, but of something far more insidious: her ability to infiltrate power structures without ever appearing to enter them. She understood that political influence did not begin in council chambers or war rooms, but in the quiet exchanges between advisors, the whispered concerns of generals, the insecurities of leaders who believed themselves untouchable. It was in these private fractures that she planted her sharpened insights, bending the trajectory of decisions before they were even spoken aloud. Her strategy was elegant because it left no trace. The decisions she shaped seemed to originate from the very people she intended to control. She approached political manipulation the same way she approached individuals, by identifying psychological leverage. Advisors often hid fears behind arrogance, leaders masked uncertainty with displays of strength, and rivals covered vulnerability with calculated hostility. She could read through all of it. A single hesitation in tone, a glance that lingered too long, a contradiction disguised as confidence. These were the openings she exploited. And once she identified a weakness, she wove it into a narrative so seamless that the person began to believe her interpretation of events more than their own. They trusted her not because she demanded loyalty, but because she offered a version of reality that flattered their ambitions while feeding their fears. Her genius was in diversification. She never relied on a single method of influence, but deployed a web of interconnected tactics that reinforced one another. She used charm to disarm, logic to persuade, and carefully timed emotional cues to destabilize. She planted rumors without appearing connected to them, disguised threats as warnings, and framed opportunities in ways that made her involvement seem essential. Each move strengthened her position while weakening the autonomy of those around her. And because she never overplayed her hand, her influence remained invisible to all but the most perceptive observers. Espionage became another extension of her psychological warfare. She never needed spies in the typical sense. The people she manipulated became her informants without realizing it. They volunteered secrets in moments of vulnerability, offered strategic insights in misguided attempts to impress her, and disclosed private conversations thinking she was the only one capable of understanding their burden. Through them, she gathered information that allowed her to predict shifts in alliances, anticipate betrayals, and sabotage rivals before they moved against her. Her intelligence network was built not on fear, but on emotional dependence, making it stronger and more loyal than any army. She also manipulated perception on a larger scale, shaping how entire groups interpreted events. A small suggestion delivered to the right person would ripple outward, shifting the tone of conversations, influencing policy debates, and rewriting social narratives. She was not merely controlling individuals, she was controlling the context in which decisions were made. Leaders believed they were acting strategically, unaware that their strategies had been carefully engineered by the woman standing quietly behind them, watching the consequences unfold exactly as she intended. Her true power emerged when these political players began acting in ways that benefited her even when she was absent. They adopted her logic, echoed her interpretations, defended her choices, and unknowingly carried out her long-term plans. Her influence became self-sustaining, embedded so deeply into the political ecosystem that removing her would have required dismantling the very structure they relied on. And that was the brilliance of her method. She did not conquer systems through force, but by becoming the invisible center of gravity around which all decisions eventually orbited, leaving her rivals with no space to escape her psychological reach. Her most dangerous talent emerged when she realized she no longer needed to manipulate decisions. She could manipulate identities. Influencing choices was effective, but transforming a person into an extension of her will was far more potent. She learned to reshape the emotional core of her targets until their desires aligned seamlessly with her objectives, creating loyal instruments who believed their actions originated from personal conviction. This transformation was not forced. It was orchestrated through psychological engineering so precise that even the victim would defend the process as self-discovery. She understood that the human mind is most malleable during moments of emotional rupture. A crisis, a betrayal, a sudden loss. These moments destabilize the internal narrative that held a person together. Instead of offering simple comfort, she inserted a new framework for understanding the world, one built around her values, her logic, her worldview. She did not tell them what to think. She shaped the conditions that made her perspective feel inevitable. Soon, allies adopted her goals as their own, convinced they had reached these conclusions through independent reasoning. This was the point where influence deepened into transformation. Her ability to create devotion was chilling not because it was loud, but because it was quiet. She targeted those who felt overlooked or undervalued, amplifying their strengths while subtly binding their emotional fulfillment to her approval. She transformed insecurity into loyalty, resentment into purpose, ambition into obedience. People felt empowered in her presence, unaware that she was engineering their empowerment to serve the structure of her control. She offered them the illusion of agency while redirecting their internal drive toward outcomes that fortified her power. The most unsettling part was how she could convert moral boundaries into flexible guidelines. Through careful reframing, she convinced her followers that extreme actions were necessary, justified, even noble. She exploited their fears of irrelevance, their hunger for meaning, their desire to belong to something larger. Once these emotional hooks were embedded, she turned them into agents capable of carrying out acts they never imagined themselves capable of. And because she positioned herself as the only person who truly understood them, they clung to her guidance as though it were the compass of their lives. These people did not see themselves as manipulated. They saw themselves as chosen. She crafted narratives where loyalty to her felt like destiny, where carrying out her wishes felt like fulfilling an essential role in the unfolding of something significant. Their devotion intensified as she deepened the emotional bond, using praise, selective attention, and calculated vulnerability to draw them closer. They became fiercely protective of her, willing to confront rivals, silence dissent, and even commit ruthless acts in her name, completely unaware that she had designed the emotional architecture driving their behavior. Over time, her followers began acting autonomously in ways that mirrored her intentions even without her explicit instruction. This was the ultimate victory. They no longer needed direction, because she had already shaped the psychological blueprint that guided their choices. They sabotaged her enemies preemptively, amplified her influence effortlessly, and defended her reputation with religious fervor. They became living extensions of her strategy, agents of her ambition, weapons, forged not through coercion, but through the reshaping of their inner world. And as more individuals fell under this transformation, her power expanded beyond what any ruler could achieve through force alone. built instead on the willingness of others to become the instruments of her darkest designs. She repeated the same cycle with every new victim, a pattern so meticulously crafted that it became her signature. It always began with seduction, though not the romantic kind. Her seduction was intellectual, emotional, spiritual. She made people feel recognized in ways they had never experienced, as if she could articulate the desires they struggled to name. This sense of being understood created an intoxicating connection, the first step in a psychological descent they would not recognize until far too late. Her presence felt like clarity, and that illusion was her doorway into their inner world. Once the bond was formed, she initiated the second phase, destabilization. She introduced tension subtly, never enough to frighten them away, but just enough to create dependency. A delayed response, a faint shift in tone, a micro-expression that hinted at disappointment. These tiny ruptures triggered insecurity. Victims began questioning themselves, adjusting their behavior to regain her approval. They did not realize they were entering a state of emotional volatility where she controlled the equilibrium. She never raised her voice. She never issued threats. She allowed their own overthinking to erode their stability while positioning herself as their anchor. The third phase was inversion. She reframed their strengths as potential weaknesses, their doubts as evidence of her insight, their fears as validation of her guidance. She controlled the narrative of their identity, turning them into students of her worldview. They adopted her interpretations because her certainty was magnetic, and her logic, though manipulative, felt irrefutable. Slowly, the inner voice that once directed their decisions became quieter, overshadowed by the influence she whispered into their lives. They began to think like her, speak like her, categorize people like her. Then came emotional erosion. This phase was the quietest yet the most devastating. She withdrew warmth just enough to ignite panic, then offered comfort only when it served her strategy. This push and pull conditioned her victims to associate emotional survival with her presence. She became the regulator of their self-worth, the keeper of their stability. They clung to her validation, even when it contradicted their instincts. Over time, their psychological resilience crumbled, replaced by emotional reflexes tied to her approval. What they once believed was affection became dependence. The final phase was internalization. By this point, she no longer needed to steer their actions. They operated according to the emotional blueprint she had installed in them. They defended her automatically, rationalized her decisions without analysis, and preemptively aligned their behavior with her expectations. She had embedded herself into their identity so thoroughly that losing her felt like losing a part of themselves. And because the transformation had occurred gradually, through subtle conditioning rather than overt coercion, they believed the person they had become was a natural evolution rather than the result of manipulation. This cycle repeated across years, across social circles, across political landscapes. Each victim followed the same trajectory: connection, confusion, dependence, dissolution, rebirth under her influence. And with every repetition, she refined her technique, becoming more efficient, more precise, more dangerous. Her power did not come from the number of followers she controlled, but from the depth of psychological restructuring she achieved in each one. Their devotion became her shield, their actions her weapon, their identities her masterpiece. If any part of this destructive cycle reminds you of something you have seen or lived, or if you recognize pieces of this emotional pattern in relationships around you, share your experience in the comments so we can uncover how these tactics continue to shape human behavior in ways most people fail to detect. As her influence expanded beyond individuals and into entire communities, she discovered a new frontier of power, manipulating perception on a collective scale. She understood that societies are not driven by facts, but by stories, and whoever controls the narrative controls the emotional climate of the people living within it. Her mastery of perception allowed her to rewrite reputations, distort memories, and redefine reality with a subtlety that made her influence nearly impossible to trace. She did not simply deceive, she engineered belief. Her first step was always to identify the emotional undercurrents shaping public opinion: fear, fascination, envy, resentment, each collective. Feeling was a tool she could tap into. Once she recognized the dominant emotion, she crafted messages that amplified it. If a population feared instability, she whispered about hidden threats. If they craved hope, she positioned herself as a symbol of vision and order. She did not need to speak loudly. Her influence spread through carefully chosen intermediaries, people already convinced that their thoughts were their own. Rumors were her most elegant weapon. She never stated anything directly. Instead, she released fragments of information, half-truths wrapped in strategic ambiguity, that invited speculation. Speculation became gossip. Gossip became belief, and belief became truth long before facts could intervene. She understood that the human mind is more likely to trust a story that resonates emotionally than one supported by evidence. By embedding her narratives into the emotional fabric of society, she created self-propagating myths that served her ambitions. She also mastered symbolism, understanding that an image or gesture could shift perception faster than any argument. A calculated expression during a public gathering, a deliberate appearance at a strategic moment, or an absence that felt inexplicably significant, all became tools to shape how people interpreted events. She used symbolism to project strength, vulnerability, authority, or innocence, depending on what the situation demanded. People did not realize they were interpreting her actions through the lens she had already engineered. Her real brilliance, however, emerged through reframing. She could take a failure and present it as a lesson, a scandal as a misunderstanding, an act of aggression as a necessary response to protect the greater good. She manipulated language with precision, using phrases that softened harsh realities or amplified emotional impact. Her ability to redefine context allowed her to control not just what people thought, but how they felt about it. Over time, she expanded her techniques into rewriting her own history. She erased the parts that made her appear dangerous and emphasized those that made her seem indispensable. She surrounded herself with storytellers, scribes, advisors, and public voices who unknowingly reinforced the version of her identity she had created. These narratives spread through courts, markets, temples, and eventually across regions, shaping how future generations would remember her. The truth became irrelevant. Perception became immortal. And the most unsettling part was how naturally people absorbed her version of reality. They believed her not because her stories were flawless, but because her manipulation aligned with their emotional needs. She understood that humans crave meaning more than accuracy, and she offered meaning dressed as truth. Her control over public perception became so strong that even those who suspected her influence found themselves repeating her narratives simply because they felt familiar. And, as her myth grew, so did her power, casting a shadow that extended far beyond her physical presence and into the collective consciousness of entire societies. As her story spread across generations, her tactics did not vanish with her death. Instead, they seeped into the foundations of power, adopted by rulers, cult leaders, nobles, and political strategists, who recognized the effectiveness of her methods, even without understanding their origin. The psychological frameworks she refined became blueprints for influence, replicated in different eras under different masks. Her legacy was not a set of recorded teachings, but a pattern of behavior that resurfaced wherever ambition met insecurity, wherever authority relied on emotional manipulation, wherever leaders sought control without appearing to grasp for it. Throughout history, echoes of her strategy appeared in dynasties that rose on waves of fear disguised as unity, in religious movements built around charismatic figures who weaponized devotion, and in political systems that shaped public loyalty through narratives rather than truth. These leaders understood, consciously or not, that perception defines power more effectively than force. They observed how she once manipulated symbols, rituals, and social expectations, and adapted these tactics to their own time. Her approach lived on not as a philosophy, but as a psychological instinct carried forward by those who recognized the potency of invisible influence. Her foundational tactic, reframing vulnerability as opportunity, became a tool for empires seeking to consolidate control. Rulers exploited social unrest not by suppressing it outright, but by redefining it in ways that justified expansion of their authority. They learned to present themselves as protectors during crises they quietly helped escalate, mirroring her ability to create dependency through controlled destabilization. The emotional loops she engineered on individuals became mechanisms of mass influence, altering how societies interpreted fear, hope, conflict, and loyalty. Even in quieter times, when no great war or revolution brewed, her influence persisted in interpersonal dynamics within courts and councils. Advisors manipulated leaders through exaggerated praise, drawing them into webs of dependence similar to the ones she constructed long ago. Ambitious heirs cultivated alliances using charm that masked calculation, echoing her early ritual of emotional mirroring. Betrayals unfolded not through overt violence, but through shifts in loyalty made possible by carefully planted doubts. Her psychological architecture became the unspoken language of power. The methods she pioneered also flourished in more subtle arenas. Merchant guilds manipulating markets through perception rather than price, scholars reshaping historical narratives to elevate their schools of thought, and secret societies using emotional initiation rituals to bind members into unwavering loyalty. These environments rewarded those who understood the interplay between fear and desire, stability and chaos, admiration and dependence. They rewarded those who practiced the very behaviors she once weaponized with unparalleled precision. As centuries passed, her tactics evolved with technology, politics, and culture, but the core principles remained unchanged. Leaders used controlled information to shape public opinion, echoing her mastery of rumor and half-truth. They exploited collective fear to justify sweeping changes, mirroring her ability to destabilize environments to create dependence. They constructed idealized images of themselves, maintained through careful curation and narrative manipulation, reflecting her talent for rewriting personal history to secure influence. People who wield power today often believe they devised their strategies independently, yet the patterns trace back to her, resurfacing in every era where psychological manipulation becomes more effective than brute force. Her legacy persists not because she was remembered, but because the psychological structures she built remain universally exploitable. And as long as human behavior can be shaped through emotion, perception, and carefully crafted illusions, her influence will continue to echo in the shadows of societies that unknowingly replicate the darkest layers of her methodology. As her influence spread through centuries, one final tactic emerged as the most terrifying of all, a method so refined that even those who studied her legacy struggled to identify it. She learned not just to manipulate individuals or societies, but to manipulate the very narrative architecture people use to interpret the world. This ultimate tactic allowed her to shape meaning itself. Instead of controlling decisions, she controlled the lens through which decisions were made. Once a person adopted her lens, everything they saw reflected her design. The method began with subtle reorientation. She guided her targets to reinterpret events through a framework she quietly installed, framing coincidence as intention, doubt as revelation, and conflict as inevitable consequence. People stopped questioning the validity of her guidance because it seemed to align with their lived experiences. They believed she offered clarity, when in truth she offered a structure that filtered reality through her perspective. Once that structure took hold, opposing viewpoints no longer made sense. They trusted her not out of fear or devotion, but because her worldview became the only one that felt coherent. Her ultimate manipulation was not persuasion, but assimilation. She created a psychological environment in which her influence became indistinguishable from a person's own reasoning. They defended her ideas as if they were defending themselves. They adopted her interpretations reflexively, unable to trace where her voice ended and theirs began. Her control no longer relied on emotional dependence or social pressure. It persisted because she embedded herself into the cognitive blueprint her targets used to navigate their lives. This tactic revealed itself most clearly in moments of crisis. When uncertainty stirred panic, people leaned into familiar frameworks, and hers was already installed. They interpreted chaos through narratives she had crafted, believed warnings she had seeded, followed directions she had implied long before the moment arrived. By shaping their internal logic, she controlled their response to any situation without issuing a single command. Her power became self-sustaining, operating within the minds of people long after she had stepped away. Over time, scholars studying her tactics realized the full implications of her mastery. Influence based on fear could be broken. Influence based on loyalty could fade. But influence embedded in the architecture of thought itself could survive generations. Her ultimate tactic did not die with her. It echoed in political doctrines, in cultural myths, in psychological strategies used by leaders who never knew her name. The most unsettling part was how ordinary people unknowingly adopted fragments of her method, using them in relationships, workplaces, and families, reenacting the patterns she perfected centuries earlier. Her story forces a disturbing question: how much of what we believe is truly ours, and how much is inherited from the invisible architects who shaped the frameworks we use to interpret the world? It is here, in this uncomfortable question, that her legacy becomes impossible to escape. She remains present not in memory, but in method, living through the structures of influence that continue to shape human behavior in ways most people will never recognize. If this journey through the darkest layers of historical manipulation left you reflecting on how these patterns persist today, consider subscribing so you can stay connected to more investigations like this, and leave a like if the depth of this story resonated with you. And if you reached the end with your mind turning over the implications, share a comment saying, "This message was for me," so we can see how many people felt the weight of these ideas. There is another video here that expands on the hidden mechanisms behind power and influence, and if you want to continue exploring these shadows, you can follow me there whenever you are ready.